Well, hello, and welcome to the webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mack. I'm your host, Dr. Mack, and we will today in our broadcast continue to be divided into two different topics. The first one will be women in the Bible, and we're going to be taking a look at the wailing women in the book of Jeremiah. And for the second one, likes in the Bible, we'll be talking about Ebed Melek, the, the Ethiopian who rescued the prophet Jeremiah. Now, our source, our biblical source, is the book of Jeremiah. And to take care of the wailing women, we'll be looking at Jeremiah 9th chapter, verses 17 through 20. And when we get to Ebed Melek, we'll give you the additional three scriptures that go with that. Well, who's the author of the book of Jeremiah? Well, you'd automatically say Jeremiah. You would definitely say Jeremiah. Most people give him the credit of having written that Jeremiah. But one of the things that I like to look at when we look at Jeremiah is his incorporation of Africans, the Cushites, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, um, all of those persons whose skin was darker, and but he includes it. He was a Israelite priest who lived and worked in Jerusalem during the final decades of the kingdom of southern Judah. He was called as a prophet to warn Israel of the severe consequences of breaking that covenant with God through adultery and injustice. He predicted that the empire of Babylon would come to destroy Jerusalem and carry them into exile. And sadly, his words became a reality. He lived through the siege and the destruction of the city, and he witnessed the exile take place. And we can go back to Second Kings, the 24th through 25th chapter. This book came into existence in a rather interesting way, and we can see that in chapter 36, because in that chapter it tells us that after 20 years of preaching in Jerusalem, Jeremiah sensed God's prompting him to collect all his sermons, poems, and essays and commit them to writing. He did just that by employing a scribe named Baruch, who wrote down and compiled the materials into a scroll. Baruch also gathered lots of stories about Jeremiah, and he linked all the pieces together. This is why the book of Jeremiah reads like an anthology or a collection of collections that have all been arranged to present this prophet as a messenger of God's justice and grace. It is also one of the prophetic books to read because of Baruch's work. Well, who wrote the book of Jeremiah? Well, it is that collective messages that were put down, and it is attributed to uh, Jeremiah the prophet, the priest himself. However, Baruch is given credit for the compilation of material. The events described and predicted in the book of Jeremiah take place during the time before, during, and after the Babylonian exile from 586 to 539 BCE. The literary style contained in the book of Jeremiah is prophetic, apocalyptic, and narrative. So he combines all three. The structure of the book of Jeremiah can be divided thusly. Chapters 1 through 25 detail God's warning of judgment towards Israel. Chapters 26 to 45 describe the stories of disaster and a message of hope. Chapters 46 to 52 conclude with a collection of poems about the impending judgment of Babylon and the exile of Israel to Babylon. So we're going to focus on the first part and not all of it, the book of Jeremiah, chapters 1 through 25. And it can be subtle accusations and warnings of judgment. So in the book of Jeremiah, it begins with God calling Jeremiah to be a prophet and giving him a dual vocation. He was to be a prophet of Israel and the nations, and his words would uproot and tear down, and also plant and build up. That's Jeremiah 1st chapter, verse 10. Sort of a dichotomy there. You are going to uproot and tear down, but then you also going to build, you're going to plant and build up. I think that is why I love the last verse in the book of Jeremiah. In other words, Jeremiah was to accuse Israel and warn them of God's coming judgment, but he was also to give a message of hope for the future. The introduction perfectly summarizes the first large section. So, although we have 52 chapters, we're going to say with three major themes: accusation of Israel, injustice, and hope for the future; God's promise to not abandon his people; the promise of covenant renewal through the Messiah. We have those very large ideas that we have. And we're going to have you go back in your memory all the way back to the covenant at Sinai in Exodus 24, verses 1 through 18, because that's when God did do that. But because Jeremiah is dealing with an overarching theme and judgment, we have to go back and realize what they were supposed to do. There's an element of grace also present in these events. The fall of Jerusalem comes nearly 900 years after the original covenant between God and the Israelites in that Sinai desert. So we have this extended period of time, and we have to remember that God had been both patient and merciful, allowing his people the opportunity to turn from their sinful ways, a lifestyle they began not long after they struck the original covenant with God. So we see where they are. And we basically talked about the setting already. So where are we now? Well, Jeremiah's ministry began in 627 BC, and it ended sometime around 582 BC with his prophecy when the Jews fled into Egypt. And that's Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, chapters 44 1. For the majority of the time, Jeremiah based his ministry out of Jerusalem. The southern kingdom of Judea fell during Jeremiah's prophetic ministry in 586 BC, having been threatened for many years by outside powers from Assyria and Egypt, and then eventually the conquerors, the Babylonians. So Jeremiah found himself addressing a nation hurtling headlong towards judgment from God. The Israelites had may have feared the future as the outside powers drew near, but rather than respond with humility and repentance, and you notice we'll get these words: humility and repentance and grace. The people of Judea primarily lived as islands unto themselves, disregarding both um, the Lord's words and the covenant that they had made. For vocabulary, we have to stop and talk about the wailing women because these are the center of part one here. They were the mourners. They were the keeners for hire. And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 9, in those verses 17 through 22, um, we have to have a clear understanding of who and what they were. And the question is, were there male equivalents to these wailing women? From my files, I've not found out that there were any who did the wailing. However, there are some scholars who say they did write some of uh, laments that were wailed, but they were not active participants. This was a job for women, and usually for older women. Uh, but it was one that uh, was passed on from generation to generation. So the mourning women or the keening women or the wailing women, we're a group of women who were professional mourners, hired to lament for a particular occasion, to express the grief of not only the family but all those who were concerned and who had suffered a loss. So, in the context of Jeremiah in these verses, it is God that caused these women to come and mourn for Israel, considering the Babylonian captivity that would overtake Jerusalem, um, because of their failure to repent. The custom of professional mourning was widespread throughout the ancient Near East and virtually throughout all human history. Women were the only professional mourners in almost every case. Hebrew history shows us that the practice of women mourners has always been it's always been done by women. Even within the extra biblical material, we will find women who will be doing that because there's this feminine sense and the accomplishment uh, that was done because of the training that would be passed on to their daughters. So history provides us no evidence that there were ever any male equivalents to reinforce an earlier statement. So let's take a look here at the first morning that we have documented in the Bible. So Maria Shriver talks about, she goes and she takes the verse from Genesis 23 and 2. And Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. So with this verse, we are invited into history and we are given an opportunity to witness this account of mourning. And notice that the wailing is done by Abraham because he's the husband. But uh, it's the first time that it's documented in there. So death figured prominently in earlier chapters, but here we have a woman, Sarah, who is mourned for, and Sarah, who is mourned with the women. Abraham, her husband, was one of the principal ones because of his affection for her. Yet sources disclose that in ancient Near East, the act of mourning was typically associated with the women, and that throughout antiquity, even in Greek and Roman times, the ritual continued. And by the way, it still continues today in some of the smaller areas. And in even I do like this in the book of Jeremiah, he lets us hear the bitter weeping of Rachel mourning over her absent children. That's in Jeremiah 31, verse 15. In that book also, we have the songs of communal loss as a maternal legacy is put on display. Because of the disaster, the prophet instructs the women thus: teach your daughters wailing and one another lamentations. So we're looking at Jeremiah 9 and 19. So we do have it still as we have plenty of documentation to prove that it was an event carried on by women. So in our topic as we go through today, what was the significance of these wailing women in the book of Jeremiah? Well, the wailing women are mentioned in the book as the mourners who are lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, you've done the first 8 chapters and you've read it. You know that this impending doom, really, we can go back to Huldah when we talked about Huldah and Josiah. Now, Huldah was a contemporary of Jeremiah, but she was also a relative of Jeremiah. So, I mean, even when Josiah put in the reforms, people were giving lip service to it as it were. And another reason, the whale symbolized the presence that highlights the themes of mourning. And those themes were that theme basically is repentance and the consequences of disobedience. We have this theme over and over: disobedience and then failing to repent. Another one is that the scholars interpret the wailing women as representatives of the collective suffering and anguish of a community. And the last one, it allows us to study the role of the wailing women and provide insights into the prophetic messages and historical content in the book of Jeremiah. Now, what does the Bible say about these wailing women? This is what the Lord Almighty said. Consider now, call the wailing women to come. Send for the most skillful of them. Let them come quickly. And, it goes on. So, what did Jeremiah say? And Jeremiah lamented for Josiah, and all the singers, were in a form of lamentations for that day. But Jeremiah also understood that with the death of Josiah, the nation too would uh, really understand the reason for lamentations to be given. He would understand that. What does Yahweh say about mourning women? Well, Yahweh of says, consider and call the mourning women that they may come. Send for the skillful ones that they may come. You know, so we have um, the understanding here that this is going to be not a small event, but a major event. Well, the first document I took a look at was Dr. Jean Porter King, and she entitled her piece, It's Time to Call Out the Wailing Women. Now, this particular piece, in order to understand why Dr. Mike is doing something on the wailing women, is very relevant today. She starts off in a reflective mood, growing up in a religious situation, as she refers to it, the church of my youth. Um, the wailing women were led by her granny and then by her aunts, and that they would sometimes, after an event, these were praying women who would sometimes all together without any prompting. It's time to call out the wailing women. And when those situations got tough, in their homes or in the neighborhood, in the community, or in the nation, they raised up that call again. It's time to call the wailing women. Well, who are the wailing women today? Well, these are the women who have suffered today or who are witnessing the suffering today, very much like those in Jeremiah 9th chapter, verses 17 through 20. But the waiting women were the professional mourners of the ancient time. They are the professional workers today. They are the women who lead corporations and education and research facilities and financial empires. But they are the ones who have such faith and belief that thus said the Lord. So, and our writer uses the episode of George Floyd when he was killed by police in Minneapolis, and with the knee in the back, and or when there was a disproportionate rate of death among black and brown people with COVID-19, or we had the person who sicked the police on a man, accused him of a crime that he wasn't guilty of, and the only apparent reason for her action was that he was wearing black skin. Almost recently, and this is not one she had, with a woman who tried to drown the two Muslim kids in the state of Texas just because they were Muslim. Um, it is time to call out the wailing women. So they come in the protests, as you have seen them on TV. They come as a collective group, and by their very presence, they are saying enough is enough. And they come in force, but they usually come in peace, even though there have been many uh, powder kegs uh, that could explode the pent up energy from years of community sufferings. But these are the women who come with their signs and their prayers in their hearts who want to protest. In other words, I'm saying that the wailing women come now as women of protest. So there was a person in the 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue who even threatened to call out the U.S. military against his own citizens. And he turned a deaf ear to the protests, although the women continued to wail. We will be looking at Juliana Clasius in a moment, where we talk about calling the keeners, who is another word for the wailing women, because they become an image of the survival in a traumatic world. They become a symbol. These women do for survival in a traumatic world, and it is closely relationship. It is closely related to the metaphor of God who weeps, and that's Jeremiah 8 chapter 22nd verse, and the powerful symbol of survival of the injured people seeking to come to terms with the tragedy. Now, Clausen continues, and I love the imagery that she uses. She continues where she says it's not so much that we see the proverbial mountain shaking to the heavens, or the heavens turning dark, or joy disappearing like the birds who are flying away, but the image of the wailing women calling upon the community to join in the wailing and the weeping may offer resources to deal with trauma that's so violently broken into their home. And here we in this section where Jeremiah talks about death coming into death in the street, death coming into the home, death not coming not necessarily through the doors, but death coming through the windows. You have such beautiful imagery here that it's very difficult to really miss it. But the tradition of the wailing women is well documented. There's recent research, continuing research. And out of that research, we have found that the wailing women were usually older women in the community. Not saying that the other women couldn't do it, but reasoning being that the older women had experienced a share of loss, and they looked at too many lifeless black bodies or brown bodies thrown into the street, and they had for a long time prayed, to God to bring a better life for the aunties and the grannies who made up the wailing women. When we get to Carson, we'll be able to see a little bit more there. The fact that the older women were used also acknowledges that as the women get older, we're talking women in the Bible, that they still have much to give to the community. Now, we have the calling out of the tears, and we have this whole thing that comes through for the loss of our children, the generation that's almost lost. But here we take the role of the wailing women, and we allow them to go through and to speak for the whole community. As we go through Clausen, we'll talk about why that's important and why it becomes something that goes on throughout. Because we have the wailing women, we have again, the image of mothers who are praying, who are protesting, who are preaching, who are leading organizations, and they're planning and they are active in what goes on. So let's take a look at how we would explain the book of Jeremiah, especially Jeremiah 9. So in chapter 8, we saw that Jeremiah was genuinely filled with sorrow for his people. He wasn't callous to their plight. He grieved for them because he had done what he was supposed to do. He had delivered the message, or he had spoken the message, but they had not heard him. So if we look at Jeremiah 9, in the first verse, we have a grief being done. And then for the next couple of verses, we have Jeremiah's expressing that he wants to escape. He wants to run away to the wilderness. Just let me go away. And then in the next verse, the Lord speaks to Jeremiah, and it sort of negates this idea of running away. And he reminds him again about the deceit that he had tried so hard to denounce, but he sort of, in a nice way, gives Jeremiah credit for doing it. And then there's a mountain, and then God grieves. There's sarcasm, and we get down to where God actually spells it out that we know that we're going to be, these people are going to go into exile because they have not heard, they have not heeded what was asked. And then we get down to verse 17 to 22, where he calls out the wailing women. And then we get on down a little bit further, where the mourning women or the wailing women or given their instructions. And there are two parts of instruction. And then I love the way it ends at this verse where this is what Jeremiah personifies death. He gives death this human characteristic. So in verse 17, he says to call out these wailing women because it's important. And in the commentaries, we have the cries of these skillful women who are telling about this terrible thing that is to come. And you get this picture, even when we talk about the death of the not being able to bury the dead. Remember when we talked about Cosby back in the book of Numbers? Leaving the dead out to rot was one of those things that was just not acceptable. So weep for yourselves and for your children. That's in Luke 23, 27 and 28. So this is what he's saying to them to get them to understand. We continue looking at verses 12 and 12 to 22, and we can almost hear the sound of the wailing and the reason, understanding the reason why that is going on. And there are no children playing in the street, and there are no young men left. So you have to hearken to the word of the Lord and mourn with godly sorrow. This alone can bring true comfort and can turn the heaven afflictions into precious mercies. We continue to go through, and the whole role of the wailing women is, teach your daughters and your neighbors, the dirges and the lamentations, because I love this part. He says, there will be a harvest of death that will be so large that the number of trained women will not suffice. So you're going to need more of these wailing women. You're going to need more of them to mourn because this whole thing is going to go. One of the things I realized as I was going through is that Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem. He did not go into exile like some of the others did. He did not. So um, death comes into the houses, it comes into the palaces, it sweeps the children from off the street, you know, and all of this. You've been told what you need to do, you have chosen not to do it. So Huddle's message was understood when she gave it as a prophetess, and God did give them peace and a blessed quietness there, but there was conflict in mourning. So we have to go through and take a look at this. So we look at the verses. Verse 19 expresses the content of the lamentations that these women are saying. Um, we are ruined. That's in chapter 4, verse 13. But it also goes back to Deuteronomy 28, verse 29. We are put to great shame. We have left the land. And that's Jeremiah 7 and 15. Our homes are destroyed. You're getting this picture, something even so hard to imagine, but having already been experienced here. So you're getting the picture of what happens here. You're getting the picture of this personification um, that's going to come, this death, this special message. Excuse me, this special message. So they had already start to believe in the mythology of the god Baal. Remember that? And we also have the Mesopotamian myth of a demon who was around at the time, the Canaanite fertility worship, where the people were not listening to God but getting more involved in that. We had talked a little bit earlier about Carlson's calling the Keeners the image of the waiting women, a symbol of survival in a traumatic world. Well, let's go back to these women that we were talking about, these professional mourners that we had. And these women portray the image of allowing the people in their dirges, in their lamentation, and allowing these people to understand the powerful thing that is to happen and what's going to happen to the survivors who are not killed, but at least that are injured. The whole topic is one of tragedy, okay? and we talked a little bit about the birds flying away and not coming back again, because that again was the experience, that was the invasion of the country by the Babylonian army, led by, and ask you to go back, led by Nebuchadnezzar, when he forcibly removed a large number of the people into exile. This will put us in the story of Daniel. But we'll stay with Jeremiah for a second longer as we go through here. So the second round of attacks occurred around 587 BCE. It destroyed the city, it destroyed the temple, and it ended with the people of Judea further exile to faraway Babylon. And from the depths of those anguished times, we have the dirges, we have the poems, we have the laments that Jeremiah recorded. Um, it's very important that we take a look and we remember that Jeremiah himself is undergoing a self. You have to, at some point, we'd like to take a look and look at all of the effect of the trauma that Jeremiah is having, because he knew in advance, he said in advance that these were going to happen. Uh, and we talked about how death would enter and how bad it was going to be, how the mourning women would appear only once in the book of Jeremiah and have received little attention in the terms of what their grand narrative of judgment and destruction was going to be, but it would be such a way that it would have such a lasting effect upon them. So, God who weeps, we talked about that in chapter 8, 22. So we go even further down, and the weeping, lead us in the weeping and the wailing. So we have the women who would come out and they would do the full grief. Now, why would that be important that they would do the full grief? Well, let's go back and take a look. They were summoned, a group of women like known as the mourning women were summoned to weep for Saul and Jonathan, and that's in Second Samuel, the first chapter of the 25th verse. And the women of the nations were chanting lament over the hordes of Egypt, and that's in Ezekiel 32, 16 through 18. The women in Jeremiah 9, which corresponds to well documented information, not just in the Bible, but also in theological research. What we have is this public grief that is transformed by the enslaved women from the state of invisibility to a position of authority and significance. So, from a woman as an object to a woman as a subject whose action, as we will see, have the power on the community influence. So, as I said, so much research has been done. And they think, and in some cases, they were documented that the 98 Psalm was often used as far as the chanting. So much so, that there's so much history. Facing the time by going out into the streets, by disheveled hair, uh, tearing their garments, clothes, putting the dirt on the clothes. All of these actions brought the community together, allowed them to share the tears, to cover the dirges that the women were given. And that's to feel better than focus, to feel emotionally better. All had shared in the group. Not so you have to take a look at her, one who is either forgiveness or one who did the testimony. That's how some leaves. He talks something about a trauma theory and forgiveness is the survivor who is left behind, even though they are pain, but they're still able to stand up and speak on behalf of others, even though the effects and the calamity are beyond explanation. You see that in Jeremiah chapter 9. So without the women as witnesses, the victims of violence or attack would fall into oblivion. It just isn't said that the dead would lay in the fields and there would be no one coming behind to pick them up. There were no waiting women who held them still. There were no waiting women whose tears would be offered um, in such a way. Then this countless vision would not have been able to those tears from the women challenged the community. As the form and patience in the face of so many social injustices threatening to upending a society as a whole. So, being summoned by God, they had a mission to go. Very important that we remember and acknowledge the wailing women of today. So the next time you see a news story, then you understand the women in the story. Most of the time, they're making the statement. So the image of these women should be one that is not because throughout history, women tears have been visual signs of pain and injustice around the world that people suffered in the past and continue to experience. It's just a message that we always especially about the fighting women of today. Willa Jackson did a great job about slavery women. Um, Willa Jackson, who was she was she called a feminist or a womanist, and she did a great job referring to why the women in the culture are bad. Whether they know the person or be relative to the person, but they are connected. They are connected because of the so so there's always conflict with the establishment and the need to have the type of women that and those women come or in some cases those women from church, meaning they know that they're not attending the quote unquote building, but they understand and they are willing to you know, church will be about today. This was such a pleasure to do. We're talking about Ebed Melek, and he was the Ethiopian eunuch in the story of Eunuch. And it's important, excuse me, that we know his story and that we share his. There were two Ethiopians that we were in yesterday. There was one other who was actually an African prince who was reading the script of Jeremiah, which caused him to go there. And he, the well, sister, I like to call it a sister, because of the, um, I have so much more to say about the Wailing Women and some of the songs that are associated with it. So let's go down and take a look at another. So we're going to be looking at the book of Jeremiah 13th chapter, 23rd verse, 37th chapter, verses 7 through 13, 39 through 54. So we're talking about courageous and whose legacy in biblical history is often overlooked, not true. But I believe it should be highlighted because it was a pivotal story within the confines of a divine promise. So, if God is a servant, maybe I don't know, and I don't whether he worked just strictly in the harem, as some of the eunuchs did, but whether he was just a court personnel, meaning that around um, around the ruler at the time. The reason so many scholars say that he was a court personnel is because he felt comfortable again share with him what was going on. So his story is one of bravery and divine recognition, providing valuable lessons in moral integrity and his legacy offers more than the historic figure. It challenges us to reflect on the timeless values of justice and righteousness. Now, what is his role? Well, in this particular biblical narrative, it turns out this is a turbulent time in the kingdom, and this is the kingdom of Judea. And he serves as the first notice when he served in the court of Zedekiah. Despite his status as a foreigner and a eunuch, uh, Ebed's actions reveal a deep commitment to justice and compassion. You know, upon in a time when there was widespread corruption and moral decay. We talked about that being two of the themes that we have in the book of Jeremiah. We have that social injustice where no one cares about anybody else, and that corruption, it was just okay as long as they got done. It was also a hot political climate. Um, which was fraught with tensions and no one trusted anyone, and there was the imminent threat that the Babylonian conquest was going to occur. So somebody was listening to the prophet Jeremiah. But at this point, the prophet Jeremiah was imprisoned for his prophecies, which were deemed treacherous by the ruling authorities. So Ebed, recognizing the injustice of Jeremiah's plight, took the bold step that would define his legacy. He approached King Zedekiah and he pleaded with for the prophet's release. He argued that Jeremiah had been wrongfully condemned and was at risk of dying in that cistern where he had been cast. Now, because it's a cistern, we're talking sort of an underwater aqueduct. Later it would be referred to as an aqueduct. And it was already muddy. But Emily was able to appeal to the king. This was a brave act because one didn't approach the king. We know that. And he went out and he was given permission to rescue him. So he said, these are some old rags, and you put them down. They're worn out clothes. And as you put them down, it will lift you up and out of that cistern without causing further harm. So it was an act of kindness. It was an act of courage that saved Jeremiah's life. But he also underscored Ebed's unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless to the personal risks involved. Now, rescuing Jeremiah isn't something that everyone would have done because it would have been dangerous to even be associated with him. But Ebed's was both swift and safe, and he was able to get Jeremiah out of the cistern. And Jeremiah continued to do his preaching, although that's why he had been put in there in the first place. But the speaking out is something that's not always done. It's better sometimes, but it's not right always. You know, most people would think it's better than I think in terms of myself. But what Ebed has done, he has inspired and he's led others under dire circumstances, and he's left a mark on history that will be observed because of his action. Now, we had that divine promise that we talked about. The courageous actions did not go unnoticed in the heavenly realm. His unwavering commitment to justice and compassion earned him divine favor. The recognition came through the prophetic message delivered by Jeremiah, affirming that Ebed's faithfulness and moral integrity were acknowledged by God. It was a moment that transcended the immediate political and social turmoil, offering a glimpse into the broader spiritual implications of his deed. You don't know who's watching, you do what. Uh, and even if you think no one is watching, God is always watching. And you want to receive one of these divine promises. So his legacy and his significance, um, it is a testament to the enduring power of individual action in the face of systemic adversity. His story, though it is a brief story in the biblical text, resonates with all ages as an example of how a person's courage can influence the course of events and inspire future generations. So, Ebed demonstrated the true heroism often lies not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, resolute commitment to doing what is right, even when it is neither popular nor safe. This is an Ethiopian eunuch here who reminds us that the essence of moral integrity transcends the political boundaries, and we have to do what is relevant and what is right. Now, many scholars have tried to understand where Ebed got this uh, idea that God was there. Well, he was there listening to Jeremiah and the other prophets too. But his story speaks to the importance of empathy and resourcefulness in leadership. Now, you say, but he wasn't a leader. He was. His ability to devise a compassionate and effective solution to a dire problem gives great value to his thinking and his creativity and his actions of kindness. You know, this wasn't done so that he would get something out of it. It was done because it needed to be done. It was done because it needed to be done. All type of persons were caught up in this clashing of the empires, and those who listened understood, even though many of those who listened were led away. They were led away into slavery. But the message that Jeremiah delivered, well, it inspired those who believed, that those who believed and didn't listen to the weak and indecisive king. It enabled them to go on and return in some cases, or their descendants to return when they were freed from it. So the faith of Ebed in this context, it was a politically hot situation in the court. He knew, he knew those persons around him who did not favor Jeremiah. And he knew Jeremiah would die without help. And we know that from 38th chapter, which is 7 through 9. So he chose to intervene on Jeremiah's behalf, which was a bold and risky move. But his strategies proved to be right, and it was a way of beating those who were hopeless. We know from all of this that Jeremiah had been accused of treason because he was speaking against what the king thought of. We see the king as both weak and indecisive, but we know that the faith of one person, an Ethiopian, there. So we get the lessons of faith from Ebed, and as I close, we will share them. It appears in only 2 chapters in the Old Testament. His story does. It is one that can inspire Christians today. Here are some principles that we can learn from the faith of Ebed. God notices. You need not be someone influential and powerful to be protected and blessed by God. You don't have to do that. God can use anyone to fulfill his plans. Life is unpredictable. And lastly, we know that God will give us the information that we need, even though it may be an unknown or little known man in a bad situation. There's plurality in the book of Jeremiah regarding Ebed's story. But as we go through, we have to remember that you sometimes have to speak out at the risk of adversity and harm to yourself. But if you believe, God will be there on faith. Remember those things that God has said the people had forgotten to do. Remember the covenant was one of them. And to start worshiping another God, and our God was another. As we close today, I want to start inviting you for next week, when we'll be moving into the book of Lamentations. And Lamentations is written by Jeremiah. And we will continue to take a look at the Africans that are in the book of Jeremiah. When we look at Ebed, one last thing, we know that he was instructed in a way by Jeremiah, which was to lead to his salvation. So we read verse 12 in the chapters that we have today. We get a picture of the scene, the whole scene from beginning to end. And in it, we are prepared to see that these are all great salvation verses. The picture that we see is that we know that the soul of Christ can lead us to that. We know that he can call the sinner to be whatever he or she needs to be in order to be saved. We know as we read the story that it did not, Ebed did not rest until Jeremiah was saved, and he became a soul winner, as it were. He became a soul winner. And the people who heard the story later had effects upon them. And in David Amato, when he talks about Africans in the Old Testament, he uses Ebed as one of those who affected both those inside the palace and those who were out. Even though calamity was striking all around him, he was aware that his actions would cause others to look. There, I was able to find a very old piece. It was done by Amos R. Wells from 1862 to 1933. It is basically just Ebed. Talks about Ebed as being one who took the authority, and he went to the king's palace, and in the storeroom where he took the worn clothes and the old rags that he used to put in the sistrum. Then Ebed, the Ethiopian, said to Jeremiah, "Now put these worn-out clothes and rags under your armpits, under the rope." And Jeremiah did so. And that's in Jeremiah 38 verses. You find the whole text in verses 10 through 12. He wrote a beautiful, long poem, basically honoring him. Even Bishop T.D. Jakes and Sarita Jakes of the Potter's House did work on Ebed, and they called him, he was a radical in the fight for what was right. In other words, you step out on, even though you may not understand it, you step out on faith to do what is right. We have those persons who know all of the black heroes, but he is advocating, Jakes is advocating that we take a look at Ebed, and let's take a look and understand that God is no respecter of person. He honors the faithful heart. So the black history that we have here, we have to acknowledge it as a notable figure and a person of excellence. And we can look in the Holy Bible and we can find the persons who exemplify wisdom and understand that it is generational. It has generational. There's a great backstory to Ebed's life, and it's worth knowing. So even if you only read it once a year, I would suggest you read it more than once a year. But if you read it just once a year, you have to understand that to be radical is not to rely on the world around you to tell you what's wrong or right, but to stand up as one person doing what you feel is right. Now, even though he was a controversial prophet, Jeremiah did stand for what was right. Even though his own personal struggle were pronounced, and God does talk to him. And remember, we were talking about how he wanted to escape, but he did follow the teaching, and he grieved. He grieved so for the people who did not listen. They did not listen. They would not listen. And the destruction did come just as was predicted by Jeremiah. The Cushites were already there. Jeremiah knew the story of the Cushites, and he saw them as not persons as were seen after slavery. For him, the Africans were a wise group of people. They were a smart group of people. They were places of refuge. They served as places of refuge for those who, even as this war came on, when the Assyrians came, when the Egyptians came, and eventually when the Babylonians came. So he saw them as persons of great value. And we will continue that part of it on next week. The Ethiopians were given a special place for him. He did the quote about changing the spots. It would be more difficult to change the spots of a leopard, So there are so many of these catchphrases within here. So the image that Jeremiah portrayed, first of all, it was one of an African or Africans being led to salvation. He had no problem with that. We understood that they were military in their outgoing and that they were an instrument and an object of judgment, and that they were portrayed as having a high moral sense of judgment and courage. And that's in Jeremiah 38, verses 7 through 10. Join me next week as we take a look in the book of Lamentations, also written by Jeremiah. And we'll be looking at the bereaved widow. And we will continue to look at Jeremiah's treatment of Africans as he puts them in both books. Africa was a violation for Israel. And Jeremiah says that in chapter 13, verse 23. It says that. So as we go through, we'll see that he is one who wrote very much about them. And his writings influenced the churches in Africa, and today continues to influence the churches in Africa. So as we go through, please remember, it isn't always your position, whether or not you would call yourself a wailing woman, or whether you see yourself as an Egyptian eunuch. Your job, big or small, is to remember your covenant with God. It is to remember to do what is right, even when the rest of the world is going a different way. And to look at the wordings in the book of Jeremiah and think of where we are today. Do we need more wailing women? Do we need more Ethiopian eunuchs? This is the end of our session. May God bless and keep you. Thank you.